Right now, my signature program, Scribble School, is open for enrollment, but not for long. This is the robust program that will take you from knowing nothing or a little bit about hieroglyphs to reading the common text you're going to actually see in museums, online, and on trips to Egypt. And there's a very special bonus available right now for the first 25 people who sign up by Friday, May 15th. They'll get the special bonus Hieroglyph a Day planner. This planner is not available anywhere else. It's not sold separately. This is the only way to get it. So you'll want to check out all the details and grab your spot in Scribble School at scribbleschool.com. Welcome to Voices of Ancient Egypt, the podcast for people who don't just want to learn about ancient Egypt, but want to understand it on a deeper, more meaningful level. I'm Melinda Nelsonhurst, an Egyptologist with a PhD in the field and years of experience teaching at the university level, working in Egypt, and training students around the world to read real ancient Egyptian texts. I've spent decades studying this civilization in a traditional academic setting so you don't have to, and so you can access knowledge that's usually locked behind academic walls. This podcast brings ancient Egyptian history, beliefs, and language to life, and shows you that learning hieroglyphs is possible, no matter your age, background, or schedule. So whether you want to read hieroglyphs in museums, on social media, or on your next trip to Egypt, you'll find the tools, stories, and encouragement to make it real right here. Let's hear the voices of the ancient world together. Hello, and welcome back to the Voices of Ancient Egypt podcast. What we're going to hear today is actually a really fun episode where we dive deep into a particular type of object from ancient Egypt. And it happens to be a type of object that's a great example of the work that we do in my next level hieroglyphs program, Master Scribe. We get into reading higher level texts in the program like historical accounts, letters, stories, the Book of the Dead, and heart scarabs, which are exactly what we're going to talk about in this episode today. Master Scribes is my 6-month group program for learning to read next level hieroglyphic texts, and it's opening for enrollment very soon. This program will take you from reading some of the most common texts that you'll see in places and from ancient Egypt to reading the next level texts with confidence. This is done with innovative curriculum as well as tons of support from me. It's like having an Egyptologist in your own back pocket. Because of this, space is very limited due to the high level of support from me, so you'll want to jump onto the waitlist now at masterscribes.com to be ready for when applications open. So let's dive into the content today about heart scarabs. So first thing you might wonder, you might have seen them around, or maybe you've never seen one and you're like, okay, Melinda, what's a heart scarab? What's that all that about? So let's talk a bit about just the basics of what heart scarabs are first, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. Essentially, heart scarabs are large amulets. An amulet being essentially an object that can be used for beneficial purposes, oftentimes for protection, but it could be other benefits as well. And in this case, heart scarabs, this type of amulet, we call them that because they're shaped like a scarab beetle, but they were used in a way with a person's heart and placed usually on the body, near the heart. So they're shaped like a scarab beetle on top, but the bottom is flat so that text could be written on them. And there's particular hieroglyphic texts that are written on the bottoms of these, and we're going to get deeply into that in terms of what they're there for and exactly what it says. Now, when it comes to the physical form of heart scarabs, first of all, the earliest ones that we have that survive are from the 13th dynasty. So what you could call either very late Middle Kingdom or early Second Intermediate period, depending on how you like to look at the chronology. But they quickly evolve into a little slightly different form in the New Kingdom and on, and they have some variations, but also pretty typical over time. So they're typically made out of stone, although you could potentially have another material. And texts from the Book of the Dead actually specify that ideally you should make your heart scarab out of a green stone called nem-ehef. And this is, of course, a modern pronunciation of the ancient word. And this is a type of stone that we don't actually know precisely what it was, but it's pretty clear from the name and from illustrations that it's meant to be a green stone. Now, in reality, heart scarabs are made from a pretty wide variety of stones, oftentimes dark colors, so things like green jasper, basalt, schist, but also sometimes some not-so-dark stones such as steatite. They're generally in the range, in terms of at least the ones I've looked at, of somewhere around 5 to 7 centimeters in length, so they're pretty big compared to some of the little scarabs that you might see from other contexts. So scarabs could be used for a wide variety of things. That is, little sort of stones shaped like scarabs, I should say, not necessarily the beetles themselves. And so you might see actually quite small ones of only like a centimeter, for example, or maybe even smaller, that might be used for stamp seals or for jewelry in other ways. These are a good bit larger, although they could sometimes be smaller or bigger than that range of 5 to 7 centimeters that I said also. And they were shaped like scarab beetles because the sun god was associated with the scarab beetle in his morning form called Khepri. And this is the form that the sun took when he rose in the sky every morning. And the rising of the sun was seen as a daily rebirth. And ideally, the deceased would, of course, be able to be reborn into the afterlife, so you have that association, as well as the idea that we would hope to actually be able to live among the gods in the afterlife, or at least part of the time, and that maybe you might even get to ride in the solar boat with the sun god. So you have sort of multiple layers of association with the scarab beetle and its association with the sun. And typically these heart scarabs were used by placing them on somebody's body during mummification, during the wrapping stage, and placed in the general chest area. Not really very specifically exactly in the position of the heart, but in that general sort of center of the chest area. Although they could be sometimes a little higher, they could move around. Sometimes they're placed in a setting and on a chain made out of gold. And those descriptions on how to make them that I talked about before do also say to set them in gold. But most of the time, they are not set in gold because most people couldn't afford that. I mean, most people couldn't really afford items made out of stone anyway. And those who couldn't afford ones that also had gold on them. So you get a wide variety, but you do get some that are set in gold also, and sometimes suspended on a chain. So we talked a bit about like the basics of the physical item, right? And what is it? But this, of course, begs the question is like, why do we care about this? Why was it important to the ancient Egyptians? Why is it important to us today? I think it's important to us today for multiple reasons. One of which is it is one of the many windows that we get into ancient Egyptian belief and ritual practices. So it gives us some information about how the ancient Egyptians viewed judgment for getting into the afterlife and how you would go about that. As well as it's important to us today because these are things that you will actually see in museums a lot. And so it's really helpful to have this background knowledge about it and actually understand what these objects were about and how ancient Egyptians thought of them, how they used them, and so forth, and what the texts on the bottom say. So we'll be getting into the details of the text in a little bit. But first, let's talk about why these were important to the ancient Egyptians. They were important to the ancient Egyptians because they were sort of a kind of insurance against your heart saying bad things about you when you were being judged on whether you were worthy to enter the afterlife. This is often thought about in the terms of the scenes that you see in parts of the Book of the Dead, the spell 125 specifically, the picture or what's often called a vignette where it shows the weighing of the person's heart. So we often refer to this as the weighing of the heart. And you'll see in these images the scales where the person's heart is on one side and then a symbol of the concept of Ma'at is on the other side. This could take the form of a feather, or it could take the form of a seated figure of the goddess Ma'at, who wears a feather on her head. Now, Ma'at is not just a goddess. A lot of times people tend to think of Ma'at as a goddess. She can be shown as a goddess. It's one of these ways that the ancient Egyptians really liked to look at concepts is to personify them and give a sort of divine version of them that looks like a human or human-animal hybrid. And so you do get a goddess named Ma'at, but essentially Ma'at is a concept. It's the concept of how the world should work. It's sort of, you could think of it as like divine order, or maybe you could even say sort of cosmic order from a modern viewpoint. But it's this idea of basically how the world should run, how people should behave, and all of that. And so by weighing your heart against it, this is, of course, sort of judging how you lived your life. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute also. So in these scenes, we also see the god Anubis tending to the scales, while the god Thoth watches and records the outcome in writing, since he was the scribe of the gods. Now, because the heart was viewed much like how we think of the brain or mind today, it held the identity of the person and also their memories. So, in other words, this could tell everything you had done in your life, which could be dangerous when you're being judged, right? So pictures or vignettes of the scene of the weighing of the heart show that the two sides should balance between the heart and ma'at, which would show that the person lived their life in accordance with this divine concept of divine order called ma'at. Now, since the heart was seen as not simply a passive participant in this process, there was a concern that the heart might testify against you during judgment. The heart could speak. We see this in a variety of texts, actually. And this is where the heart scarab comes in to protect the person. And we'll get into the nitty-gritty specifics of how this is done in a moment. Now, once you actually pass the judgment, Thoth announces the verdict, and then Horus would present you to his father, Osiris, who is king of the afterlife, and you would be declared Ma'acheru, or true of voice. And this outcome, of course, is always shown in the papyri, because by putting it down in there, this sort of just helps move you along towards that positive outcome. And they would never want to actually record a negative outcome for somebody, because you might make it happen, or at least give it a bigger chance of happening. They do mention occasionally in text that if you don't pass, you would be devoured by Amulet, who is a being that you see at the weighing of the heart. And she is shown as part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus. So essentially the three scariest creatures that ancient Egyptians might come in contact with. And you did not want to come in contact with Amulet. So now that we've kind of laid in the groundwork for what heart scarabs were, why they're important, and sort of what they could do for you, let's talk specifically about the Egyptian texts that are written on the bottom of them. So what's written on the bottom of them is a part of what we call the Book of the Dead today. By the way, Book of the Dead is a totally modern term. This is not what the ancient Egyptians called it. They called it the Book of Going Out by Day. And because this is associated with getting to the afterlife and also being able to travel around once you are in the afterlife, come out into the world of the living during the day, for example, and all of that. But we will use the term Book of the Dead since this is what's widely used today. And the part of the Book of the Dead that's usually used on these is what we in modern times call spell 30b. So there are some different versions of spell 30, but it's typically 30b that shows up on these, but you can have other versions as well. So 30b gets into those things that we are talking about in this episode today. That is how to protect you when you get to that judgment and ensure that your heart is not going to testify against you. So it does this by essentially repeatedly telling your heart to behave itself and not testify against you. So the typical words do vary a little bit, but it's pretty formulaic. So you get almost the same thing on tons and tons of heart scarabs, but sometimes they do have a shortened version. There's usually not a whole lot of difference necessarily in the parts that they do contain when you compare it to, say, another heart scarab. But some heart scarabs might have only half of the potential total lines you might have, where others might have all of the lines you could potentially have, and everywhere in between. So you see a wide variety. We can tell that these were often made ahead of time rather than made to order. So we can see this because a lot of heart scarabs have a blank spot for the name of the person to be inserted. Sometimes it'll say at the beginning, words spoken by, and then there'll be a space for the name. Or sometimes they do have the name. But they didn't always actually add the name, even if they left a space for it. And so because of that, we can understand that this is oftentimes how they were made, and a name would have been added in later. So after that portion where it might say speaking words by, whatever the person's name might be, then it goes into the quote of what the person is saying. So this is what the deceased person is supposed to say to their heart to make sure it doesn't cause any problems, right? So it starts out, and I'm gonna read through the whole thing here for you quickly, and then we'll go back and talk a bit about what these different parts mean, because even in translation into a modern language, it can still sound a little bit arcane and not necessarily totally clear what things are supposed to mean if you don't have a wider context of ancient Egyptian beliefs and practices and where these sort of phrases fit in with those. So this is a sort of typical, you could say, Book of the Dead spell 30b. My heart of my mother, my heart of my mother, my heart of my forms, do not stand against me as a witness. Do not create opposition against me in the tribunal. Do not make your enmity against me before the keeper of the balance. You are my Ka who is in my body, a Khnum who makes my limbs healthy. May you go forth to the perfect place from which we have come. Do not cause my name to stink to the entourage who make people in their proper positions. What is good for us is good for the listener. May the heart broaden at the judgment. Do not devise lies against me in the presence of the god. Look, your distinction exists. All right, so this is our typical sort of full writing of this spell. But what does it all mean? So at the beginning, of course, we have the my heart of my mother, my heart of my mother, my heart of my forms. So this is this initial address where the person is talking to their heart. Now, you'll see translations do vary. This is sort of my variation on the translation of this that has much overlap with many other scholars' translations also, but you'll also find some slight differences. So when there's something specific to say about that, I'll say that. So in this particular instance, when I say forms, this comes from a word that is based on the root khepr. You might notice that that's the same consonants as in Khepri, that form of the sun god, right, who comes into being in the morning and evolves. So this is a root that can be in words such as evolve, come into being, to manifest, that kind of thing. So this is used in it's getting a little technical, but like a plural noun. So you would think of this as sort of forms or evolutions or something like that. So this seems to be alluding to probably a person's different stages of life, although some scholars interpret it a little differently as simply meaning just your physical form and not meaning multiple ones, although it is written as if it's plural. So then it goes into multiple ways of basically saying not to tattle on you. So it says, do not stand against me as a witness. Do not create opposition against me in the tribunal. So this is referring to the tribunal of gods, the Aeneid, or the larger group of gods who will judge you going into the afterlife. And it says, don't, basically other ways of saying don't oppose me. So do not make your enmity against me before the keeper of the balance. So again, the god who is supervising the scales, this keeper of the balance. And then it describes the heart a bit by saying, you are my Ka who is in my body, a Khnum who makes my limbs whole. So the Ka was a part of the person related to the physical body. So it's referring to the heart as being that life force. The Ka is sort of the life force that goes into the physical body and makes it work. So it's referring to the heart as the Ka here. And then also as a Khnum, and sometimes you will see people translate this a little bit differently. It might be creator or protector or something like that. But this looks just like the word, or the name rather, for the god Khnum, who was a creator god who created people out of clay on his potter's wheel. And so this says, a Khnum who makes my limbs healthy. So this seems to be an allusion to the creation of the actual body and making of the different body parts. Then it goes on to some further wishes for what it wants what you would want your heart to do. So it says, may you go forth to the perfect place from which we have come. This is presumably referring to the afterlife, wanting to get to the afterlife. And then it goes back into things not to do. Do not cause my name to stink to the entourage who make people in their proper positions. So you'll see a little variation in this one too. Some people refer to putting people in heaps or something like that. But the idea here seems to be not to sully your name in front of this group of gods who put people in their proper places. Presumably, this also includes whether you're going to get into the place of the afterlife or not. And then it says, what is good for us is good for the listener. Or another way you could translate listener is the judge, because the word for judge really just is listener. And so the idea here being doing good things for us, like saying good things and not saying the bad things, is also good for the judge. This is not just about you. This is not selfish. This is also good for the judge, right? So let's do it. Then it goes on with another combination of sort of wishes for the heart as well as an order not to do anything bad. So it says, may the heart broaden at the judgment. So the idea of a broad heart is an idiom that means joy in ancient Egypt. So in other words, may the heart be joyful at the judgment, because what's implied here, it will be a positive judgment. And then it says, do not devise lies against me in the presence of the God. So again, just reiterating the same idea. Don't say bad things about me, especially if they're not even true. And then it ends with, look, your distinction exists. So this seems to be implying that, you're going to be distinguished apart from other people and be able to make it into the afterlife. So that's a bit about the heart scarabs. And these, like I said, these are objects you're going to see in museums all over. So it's a wonderful one to learn about. And if you want to take things a step further, I would encourage you to learn to read the hieroglyphic text on these, so that not only will you know a bit about the objects when you see them in museums, but you can actually read them. Or even if you don't happen to go to a museum and see one, you can see them all over the place online. Museum collections have photos up of them. And of course, people post pictures all over social media and websites and stuff too. So you can see them on Wikipedia and everywhere else. So it's a wonderful thing to practice with and get to know ancient Egyptian with. And if you liked this episode, this is just a tiny taste of what we do in Master Scribes. There's so much waiting for you in this program. And one of the first things that my students do and learn about in the Master Scribes curriculum is heart scarabs. It's the first main thing that they tackle, learning how to read at that level. And Master Scribes applications will open to the waitlist on February 24th, and then to everyone else on March 2nd, if there are still spaces available. And spots are really limited because this is an intimate experience, as I talked about at the beginning of this episode. So you'll want to get on the waitlist in advance if you want to have a first chance to get in and get a spot. So head on over to masterscribes.com to grab your spot on the waitlist there.